Following this talk, there will be plenty of opportunity to ask Elisabeth questions. And what we would ask you to do is that you submit your questions throughout the talk using the chat function. And I will then collate the submitted questions and put them to Elisabeth on your behalf following the presentation. Now, I'm delighted to introduce to you our speaker. Elisabeth Sandler is a fully funded Sociology PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. Her intersectional PhD research explores the coming and being out experiences of LGBTQA+ identifying Cambridge students and staff members. The findings from this study will generate action points that can be used to improve the lives of LGBTQA+ students and university employees within the UK and abroad. This piece of research is a continuation and an expansion of the Out at Cambridge study, for which Elisabeth worked as a full-time researcher in 2019, which, by the way, is the context in which I met Elisabeth in the first place. So her teaching, because she doesn't just research, she also teaches. Her teaching focuses on qualitative research methods, gender, sexuality, and family sociology. And as you know, you can follow whatever lectures in the University of Cambridge if you are a member of the university. So if you're interested, you can always go and listen to her there. But for now, I'm just going to hand over to you, Elisabeth.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to have a platform to share the study findings and to raise awareness. That's just wonderful. So thank you so much for inviting me. So also with the introduction, as you know, I was involved in the Out at Cambridge study, and this is what I'm talking about today. So unfortunately, I can't tell you about the newest findings yet, but I might point or give some hints to keep eyes and ears open for the future. But for today, let's focus on the Out at Cambridge study. Now, before I start with that, I was asked to include the life of someone who did not live then. So someone very important. I just try to actually make my slides move, which doesn't work right now. Oh, there we go. All right. So I was asked to look into the life of Anna Bidder. And Anna Bidder was the co-founder and first president of Lucy Cavendish College. Therefore, she had a massive contribution to enabling women, especially more mature female students, the access to the university. And she was a zoologist and read natural sciences and zoology at Newnham College. And at this point, it was really exciting for me because I am myself a member of Newnham College. So I went straight to the archives of my college and I actually digged up some photos during her years. So that is from 1925. I'm not sure if you can spot her yet, but it's the stripy colored woman up there on the top in the middle. And we have another one where she is just in the front on the left. And I zoomed in on that as well. So that is my college as well. So it's just this lovely connection sometimes with people. You think the world is so small. She also had a really important impact with a pamphlet, which was called Towards a Quaker View of Sex, published in 1963. And this pamphlet aimed at taking a new view on the changing sexual mores at the time. And for that, it was immensely progressive and therefore also somewhat controversial. And I had a look at this and found the following quote, which I would like to read out to you. So we are concerned with the homosexuals, of course, in this context, we need to historically contextualize it, right? So you won't hear me using the term homosexual now, but for then it was perfectly appropriate. So we are concerned with the homosexuals who say to each other, I love you, in the hopeless and bitter awareness of a hostile criminal code and hypocritical public opinion, and also with the anguish of men and women who know they love one another when marriage is impossible and only suffering can be envisaged. So it just showed to me a lot of empathy, actually, for lives that they did not share in terms of identities and experiences. They actually said they are not having these identities themselves, but for that, it was really impressive, the empathy given. And I had a very similar quote in a way that also focuses on the prospect, on a future that can be envisaged. But that was from quite some years later, so we have 56 years later, which brings me now to the Audit Cambridge study, when I sat together with a student, Eddie. All names, of course, are anonymized. Eddie is an undergraduate student here at Cambridge and told me the following. Now, I try to read it. It's that some parts of my PowerPoints are somewhat blocked with all the things Zoom wants me to see, so just bear with me. Okay. So Eddie tells me, there is something about meeting older LGBT people, especially successful ones in the field that you might want to go into. I remember I was 18 years and I went to dinner at this two people's house, and they were like 45-year-old lesbians. They're married, and I sat there, had dinner, and in the car on my way home, I burst into tears. It was because I hadn't realized that I didn't have an image of what my future could look like. They were just two women eating dinner. They live in a nice house and they live very normal lives. I didn't know what that might look like. So that was incredibly powerful to me, and to just be like, oh, I could be happy in the future. I had not even realized that I had not realized that. Thinking about my future was kind of blank. I just could not imagine it until I met these people, and I didn't know that I needed this so much. So having older queer academics is kind of like this. It's incredibly powerful to see LGBT people absolutely flourishing and succeeding in their field. It is like I could be like that. I could see myself doing that. So in a way, the similarity is with the prospect what someone can imagine for the future, and also the societal and historical context they're in which experiences are made, and also given certain meanings. We'll return to this quote actually at a future point in today's presentation, because that looks, of course, in contrast to what we've just heard in the pamphlet, much more optimistic to some extent, right? It's not always necessarily the case, and we'll unfortunately see that a bit later on. So yeah, it was really exciting for me to dig into the past. I am not a historian, I'm a sociologist, but I kind of do think of sociologists as historians of the present. So I think the main difference is I do research with people that are still alive and can ask them questions and ask them how they felt, and the impact their experiences has on their lives. And this is what I've done, and this is what I'm going to talk with you about today. So yeah, that's a good reminder. I put it here on purpose because I knew I would forget. You can read all these quotes with the page numbers in the Audit Cambridge study report, which is available online for free. Just go to the Q+ conference. Oh, I'm doing something, right? What am I doing? Oh no. I think it's gone. It will be, no. Okay, how can I remove that? This has never happened. Should I stop sharing the PowerPoint for a second, go back? Maybe it's gone. Oh,
maybe, yeah, you could maybe try that.
Oh, it's gone, I think.
Oh, it's gone.
Probably helped. Thank you. All right, so as I just said, you can look up all the quotes and even more data and context on the study and the methodology online. Also, this talk with the very same name will be published very soon in a book chapter that's published in English, and it's open access. So if that's something that interests you, you can always refer to it in the future with this publication. All right, so for today, I would like to answer two questions. The first one is, why does LGBTQ+ inclusion at universities matter? And the second one is, how can we contribute to LGBTQ+ inclusive university settings? Before I start, just some clarification on terminology and context. Context is really important because this is a qualitative piece of research and therefore it's not generalizable. So the findings need to be contextualized. There's certain borders we need to establish in terms of contextualization to make very clear how far the findings reach. So obviously these experiences are very much linked to Cambridge, for example, and to the specific individuals I was fortunate enough to talk with. So we'll now hear just a few words about the main terminology and about Cambridge once more, and participant sample. I think that's really important. So let's start with the most obvious of all terms, LGBT, LGBTQ+. There are many variations now and more letters are being added to that acronym. So what does that actually mean? So as I said, it's an acronym. So we have clusters of first letters of words that represent certain identities. And L stands for lesbian. We have gay, bisexual, trans, and the Q mostly refers to queer, sometimes more rare though, it refers to questioning. And the plus basically means that there are more identities that fall under that umbrella term, but that either came later or would be too long to add, which is, you know, it's always with identity politics, a bit controversial with terminology as well, but LGBTQ+ is the most commonly used term, so that's also the one I am using today. Now, having listed these identities, something maybe quite obvious will become clear. It seems obvious, but it was such an aha moment to me, and I am doing research in this field. So I would like to share that moment of realization with you as well, as it will be important for the findings. So when we list all these identities, it becomes clear we have different identity aspects. So most people think LGBTQ+ just refers to sexuality. Now, what does just sexuality mean? We have many different sexuality aspects even in this category. So we have identities that refer to whom individuals feel sexually attracted to. This could include gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, queer. I emphasized could because I think it's really important always to leave space and flexibility, openness for individuals to identify themselves and also define their identity. So there isn't just this one identity and all, everyone uses it in the same way. So that's, you know, we need to use it with a bit of caution here. So we had sexual attraction. Now also under which circumstances, to what extent, and whether sexual attraction is experienced at all. And these are maybe some more newer identities that were added to LGBTQ+, and that could be asexuality, demisexuality. Now, sometimes, often around heated debates, identities that are linked to sexual practices and preferences are linked to LGBTQ+ as well. For example, BDSM and kink, which can fall under queer. Again, very heated debates are around that, but I want to mention it as some of the participants also identified in that way. And sometimes, again, widely debated, we have relationship constellation that are non-normative. So we have non-monogamy, for example. So this is sexuality. We have another identity category here though, and this is gender. So we have within this acronym identities that refer to individuals' gender identification or non-gender identification. So this could be non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, agender. And we have what I call gender identification background. I like to separate these two. This would be trans. So that the gender identity an individual has now is not in line with what was prescribed when this person was born. And then we have variations in individuals' secondary sex characteristics, sex chromosomes, and hormonal developments, mostly referred to as intersex. So you see, we have a lot of different identities merged together in this one umbrella term. So that means we have differences. So not everyone who identifies as a member of the LGBTQ+ community identifies the same way, and nor does everyone have the same experience. Now, experiences vary because some of these identities are more stigmatized than others. Again, we'll hear that in the data today. Some are more relevant for a university setting, professional setting and a certain discipline. And there are also different identities that intersect with other social categories of difference. So all of that shapes people's different experiences. Now, despite all of these differences, though, we also have similarities. So despite differentials of vulnerability, what you could call it, we also have these subcategories that all historically have and still tend to be considered non-normative. So that means not according to the norm within a certain society and historical context as well. And that means that non-normative positionality means additional efforts in navigating these identities at best, and that's really the best scenario, or discrimination, oppression, and violence at worst. And this is still happening today, unfortunately. Another similarity they have is the potential to remain hidden. Now, I say potential, again, we'll hear that later in the data today, that there are some exceptions, but generally speaking, we have the potential of these identities to remain hidden, which leads to the question, also given its non-normative status and all the consequences linked to that, the question of whether one should come out and disclose these identities at all. And this is exactly what we were interested in this study, which brings me to the next term, coming out. Now, those of you who see the PowerPoint slides see a lot of white, either in form of feathers or dresses. Now, the reason for that basically is I want to tell you just the historical context of the term coming out, so the etymology, because coming out does not originate in LGBTQ+ context, as people often think. Now it's the main association. We associate coming out with non-normative sexuality and gender identities. But the term originated in the 18th and 19th century and basically referred to the event of formally entering society or the marriage market, if you want so. So that was for aristocracy and the upper classes. And I'm Austrian, and in Vienna we obviously still have these celebrations today. So these would be debutante balls and coming out ceremonies and parties, so it's still a thing and not linked to the LGBTQ+ community in this original sense. However, as Travis Scott, a communications scholar, pointed out in a really great publication, which is called Coming Out of the Closet, Examining a Metaphor from 2018, Scott said that the term was appropriated in a camp spirit to refer to a homosexual's escape from isolation and entering into the discovery of, introduction to, and integration into gay subcultures. So this term historically then was kind of adapted and now put in the context of LGBTQ+ culture, or what we would nowadays refer to as LGBTQ+, because back then we need to be historically accurate here. They wouldn't have had these terminologies. So both of these aspects, they refer to an arrival and an entry, and all of that changed with the addition of the closet. So now we say coming out, and it's a shorter version normally referring to the wider phrase, which is coming out of the closet, which basically borrows the metaphor of skeletons in the closet. That phrase, I think, dates back to the mid-beginning of the 18th century, and it basically means lifting a secret, right? Bringing the skeleton out of the closet. And so this was used in the mid-1960s liberation era gay politics. And now all of a sudden we have a meaning change. We now consider it as an exit. And linked to that exit is the idea of pride, you know? So there was a political idea behind coming out, which is very important because it leads to a coming out imperative. And that's something I've often heard when talking to participants, that they felt under pressure from outside and within their own community to come out. And the idea that not being out was linked to shame. So that is still something very, very present in the discourse of coming out today. Pride also now explains, right, is a really important inclusion act, basically, or often considered as one in terms of LGBTQ plus inclusion. So we have it as a concept, you know, out and proud. We have it as an event, and obviously today's talk is in celebration of LGBT History Month, and in June we have Pride Month. But it's also often used as a corporate marketing strategy. So everything you will hear also today about visibility is increasingly popular. And the question is also, what's the context there? And people are sensitive to whether visibility, for example, is genuine or not. Again, something we'll address later. Now, other ways to focus on LGBTQ plus inclusion so far, so before I've done the study, were mainly also the introduction or the change of social and organizational practices, and something that can contribute to that. So basically working towards equality, working towards the end of discrimination and stigmatization, all of that, what can contribute to this is research, which is exactly the reason why we started the Outed Cambridge study, which I will talk about now, just for context. So the Outed Cambridge study was a 9 months long program, well, not program, it was a study, 9 months long study linked to LGBTQ plus at CAM, which is a research initiative at Cambridge funded by the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. And we have many talks about that. We had a research report, we have a video series. So if you're interested to hear about all the amazing people who were involved or linked to the study, you can check that out later. But I'm here today to represent my wonderful team. So really important, we have Professor Sarah Franklin as the principal investigator. Sarah is also the founder of Q+, and at the time of the study was the head of sociology. I worked as the full-time researcher, so I was mainly involved in the data collection, analysis, writing up and talking a lot about this topic. We have Heather Stallard as the program administrator, and Dr. Marcin Smietana and Dr. Robert Pralat, they were functioning as study consultants. Our research questions were, how do Cambridge students and staff members manage their LGBTQ plus identities within the university community? What factors influence participants' comfort or discomfort to disclose? Factors is a really important word here, which we'll return to later on when we think about the second question, what we can do in order to contribute to more inclusive environments within higher education. And the third one, not so much a research question per se, but more a question that accompanied us throughout the entire process, was, are there patterns in the data that can guide recommendations for creating a more inclusive university community? You see our research flyer here for recruitment. So we got ethics approval, and then I employed 2 types of purposive sampling. So we had generic purposive sampling, that's the circulation of the flyer you can see on the left. Within the university, and it was really important to me not to focus on LGBTQ plus specific groups already, but to make sure as many people are included and reached as possible, regardless their levels of visibility and involvement and activism within the university. So that was circulated literally by almost every department in college and all the libraries and all the sub-bubbles to Cambridge. And then halfway through the recruitment, so around 25-30, I was doing snowball sampling just to diversify the group of people I could speak to. So one representation issue was in terms of ethnicity and race, for example. So I was specifically, also trans individuals, so I was specifically recruiting for those participants so their voices could be heard too. I then conducted 55 semi-structured interviews, including 5 pilot interviews. They were audio recorded, I transcribed them, verbatim, selected, luckily for me. And then I did a thematic analysis, so I was interested in the patterns within the data. I did also three levels of member checking, so participants could read through their quotes I would be using and consenting to them. And the third level was actually quite recently, because for this talk and for the upcoming publication 2 years later, and that led to really interesting new data as well. All right, I am having a look at the time, so I will continue now, but if any methodology geeks of you have any further questions, we can address them in the Q&A. Now, very briefly, Cambridge. I know most of us know Cambridge, but often we're too close to see the obvious. So I just want to state the obvious again, as this will have a massive impact on the data, on the findings. So we have over 100 departments, faculties and institutes, 116 libraries, over 500 clubs and societies, 31 colleges, really important. So that means spaces that basically replace families in a way. So most students will have moved out and live in the smaller community together. We have 8 museums and a botanic garden as well. And then we have Cambridge University Press and assessment. So what that means is that there are a variety of work and study spaces and a very unique university structure. All of that shapes, of course, participants' experiences. It's also an elite university that can contribute to a sense of comfort regarding some participants, especially if there are gender dress codes. The participants whose stories we'll hear today were 31 staff members throughout all the different areas of these sub-bubbles, as I said, 24 students, of which 11 were undergraduates, 13 postgraduate students, and they came from across 23 disciplines, from all the schools, and identified as gay, bisexual, queer, lesbian, trans, non-binary, pansexual, homosexual, asexual, genderqueer, phenesexual, and intersex. Despite my attempts to have my sample to be less white, that was not really successful. So we have only 11 out of 55 participants who identified as non-white. I think though that's fighting Cambridge as a system in itself a bit. So I think in a way it's almost representative of Cambridge, but yeah, it would be very important for future research to focus on that, of course. All right. Now, why does LGBTQ+ inclusion matter? To start off, I would like to read this quote by Lawrence. We had a really special interview, and I still remember it very, very well 2 years later. That's how special it was. Lawrence is a trans man and undergraduate student and said, "Cambridge as an institution is your life for the 3 years you are here and what everything revolves around here, for better or for worse. And your college and department are your 2 main institutional spaces you engage with. They are your home base, your center. And if you didn't have the kind of feeling of being able to be out and open in your home and in your intellectual space, it would affect everything else and make your 3 years so much harder here. If you have had a hard day for whatever reason, the fact that you are out and feel comfortable in college and department means you can return to those spaces. And if those institutions aren't safe, then Cambridge is not safe. And that is a big problem for people. It is a terrifying thought for me that people don't have that, because it is so vital in making sure we are well and healthy, politically and mentally and physically, and actually are able to make the most of our degrees and your institution and your time here." Lawrence continued, saying that from 18 to 21, that these are formative years also. And the idea that those would be spent having to suppress huge parts of your identity when coming to university is the point at which you should be able to say, "I'm making myself and my identity as an adult, and I'm not being constrained by school and home and the baggage of 18 years of people knowing me or knowing you from when you're a baby." Coming to university, it is so important to have that identity formation on your own, and not being able to do that, and not being able to do that safely in the main institutions within the institution, so your college and department to which you belong, is just frankly terrible. So there was a lot here. Probably you all noticed different things. I think, you know, different aspects and people's stories resonate with individuals differently. There is always a certain connection, and we also have our experiences, of course, regardless of our identifications. But something I noticed was that what characterized both quotes was the very special meaning Lawrence gives those spaces. So in the first quote, it was a space, the university, and in the second one, it was a time. So university as a space first, and now university as a time, right? So for Lawrence, and also for other participants, Cambridge with its departmental and college spaces was their home, and therefore feeling comfortable and safe was essential. Now, home is a word that is often used, and Cambridge colleges also used to advertise it. They advertise themselves as homes, and I know that because I looked it up. I only had a look at 2 of the college guides published in 2019 and 2020. Now, in this one, a guide to Cambridge colleges, 10 colleges introduced themselves as homes, and they only had half a page to describe themselves. So we have quotes such as, feels like home, a welcoming and fostering home, quickly becomes home, college is home, and 2 even refer to themselves as a family. And in the undergraduate prospectus of 2021, published in 2020 though, we have 11 Cambridge colleges who refer to themselves as home. So I only looked at these 2 guides, and we already have 16 different colleges that portray themselves as families or homes. So that meaning that is given to these university spaces, specifically regarding colleges, and also communicated by Cambridge, make LGBTQ+ inclusion within it even more important, of course. And we also saw that in Olivia's story. Olivia is or was a postgraduate student and told me, if I couldn't be out, it would detract from the sense that Cambridge could feel like home. Colleges are always saying, this is your home. So you want to be able to act like it is your home, be open with the person that you love there, and express yourself how you want to express yourself. So we had it with the colleges, and I guess that makes sense, kind of being a space where you live, eat, sleep, socialize, but also participants refer to their departments as home, especially in an intellectual sense. I will skip over that quote because I'm having an eye on the time. But yeah, we also had participants referring to their departments as home spaces too, which allowed them to just, in this sense, Olivia referred to it as breathing slightly more easily or feeling freer. And also that's something participants told me a lot, that if in reference to being out, or what they often said, being themselves, not lying about being themselves, that was a phrase often used, they just felt more relaxed and relief, liberation, one less layer of thought. So we had a lot of data on that experience. For example, Cara, an undergraduate student, said, compared to the time before I disclosed myself at Cambridge, being out to the extent I am now makes me feel a lot more comfortable with who I am and confident in myself. I feel more confident walking around and chatting to people than I used to, which is really nice. What strengthens this theme is that we have in a mirroring way almost data where people say exactly the opposite in the cases where they were not out. So for example, Ella, a postgraduate student, said, I don't share my LGBTQ identity with many people, which means that being LGBTQ becomes more an identity in an isolating way and less an identity in a collective way. Either you identify with or you identify as separate from. And I feel like I'm identifying as separate from straight people. So something we also see here is kind of linked to how we think about identities more generally now in a Western current situation, identity linked to similarity and difference. So with that, it can be very communal, but it can also be very separating and lonely in that sense. And it is disheartening if we think about how Lawrence described the university and the potential that a university could be in terms of a space of encounter, collaboration, a place to grow, to reinvent oneself, right? So yeah, in this context, I think it's even more heartbreaking to hear Ella's quote. Now, of course, some of you might not think this is all nice and good, but of course not everyone thought about Cambridge as their home. So this is very specific to students and to some academic staff members. But non-academic staff members did obviously not think of Cambridge as their home. They are more considered it a workspace where they spend though lots of time with the people they're working with. So it was a different experience for them, but nonetheless, LGBTQ plus inclusion was very important to them just because they spent so much time there and so much time around others with people that potentially could develop into friendships. So that is something, you know, that Victor said, something that he has to see his work colleagues every day and he wants to be himself around them, and his husband is part of him, so he wants to be able to be open about that. And Alice said, on a personal level, it is really important to me to be out because I don't think I feel I was having honest relationships with co-workers, which oftentimes become friendships. So it would be incredibly restrictive not to be able to disclose myself. And I would find it hard to stay in a job where I couldn't do that. So I shortened them, these quotes, but basically what they say is they speak about the university on a professional and on a personal level. Both of them actually did. So it just shows also that it's all, you know, we're all social animals in that sense. We're all interconnected. Our lives are interconnected and we spend time around others. So therefore the professional and the personal intersect in that sense. And it, yeah, feeling comfortable does become a matter even in a professional sense. So far, on a personal level, LGBTQ plus inclusion mattered because for some, specifically students and academic staff members, the university was their intellectual and potentially also their physical home, with some individuals, especially undergrads, engaging with this space at a crucial time of their overall development and with the aim of personal and intellectual growth. But even if the university as a time and space is not experienced in that sense, the sheer amount of time spent in it as a workplace alongside others makes LGBTQ plus inclusion within it important. So also the personal and professional we had so far is in line actually with my two arguments why LGBTQ plus inclusion matters. So far we've heard the personal side, but we have loads of data that actually makes a business case argument. And I know there was some controversial discussions around it being used as a business case. And we can discuss it in the Q&A, but it's nonetheless data that's there and interesting, and it makes a good argument why LGBTQ plus inclusion is important, even if people aren't convinced yet that personal lives are worth enough the safety and the comfort. So basically we have data where people express how feeling seen and being safe and feeling comfortable led to a sense of pride to be working for the university, which made them happy to contribute and to potentially contribute more as well. And so something that always comes to my mind then is Amber, who talked about the flags that are being up in LGBT History Month, so in February, exactly now, where she kind of said that this is a really nice gesture. And, you know, it's one thing to say, oh, we're all equal. And now it's the quote. Another thing is to be unashamed as an institution, unashamed of showing that you support this. So yeah, she says she contributes a lot of time and effort and energy, and she's happy to do that. She's getting paid, but she would prefer to contribute to a university where she actually feels seen and represented in that sense. And that is a kind of like a general principle, right? Especially what she said at the end here. I think the more welcome people feel, the more they will give the university. So that is something that transcends LGBTQ plus specific inclusion strategies. Erin had a similar principle. Erin said, basically you can focus on your work, right? In the end, he said, whether that is LGBTQ plus identity, whether that is culture, background, language, religion, anything like that, having a space that allows you to be yourself without question is incredibly helpful. So it frees up headspace, you can focus on your work, and that will of course benefit the institution in the end. And something some of the quotes I've already included as well, but other participants said it explicitly. If they wouldn't feel comfortable and safe, they would leave the university, or they would have to leave. They would drop out because it would be another burden that would be too much on top of mental health challenges already. So yes, lastly, the last argument for how it benefits also the institution is, as I said, universities are social spaces, and people interact within those spaces professionally, but also personally. And how one person feels, an LGBTQ+ person, will affect how others feel around them. With Chloe, who is in an academic leader function, kind of said that ever since she felt more comfortable with her identity and was out, the team is more productive, more focused as well, because she could actually enact her role as a leader better because she wasn't a closed-off person. And if you feel uncomfortable, you have to hide something, it makes you a closed-off person, which is not great for a leadership situation. And Liz said something similar, that her colleagues, non-LGBTQ+ colleagues, felt more comfortable ever since she felt more comfortable in being a trans woman. Right, so a lot of information, but I hope we all reached a point where we now actually are convinced that LGBTQ+ inclusion is important and matters. Now the big question is, but what can we do? How can we contribute to that? And I remember the factors. It wasn't a research question, and I already said it will become important. Now is the time. We have 3 main factors within the data that contributed to participants' sense of comfort to disclose their LGBTQ+ identities within the university setting, if they desire to do so. It's another thing. All my participants said it matters to them. It's important that Cambridge is a safe and welcoming space where they can decide whether to come out or not, can navigate it themselves, but not all of them necessarily wanted to be out, right? But all of them considered it important to at least have the choice to make it themselves, to create this choice themselves. So 3 factors are LGBTQ+ visibility of others, organizational symbols and signs of support, intellectual relevance, and not necessarily a factor, but I want to discuss identity-specific inclusion practices specifically linked to trans individuals. So the first one, visibility of others. So that was the biggest factor. Almost all participants mentioned that in some way. So across all the participant groups, that it was really important to their sense of safety and comfort to be out if others around them were out too, especially if those were in leadership positions. And this because it would demonstrate acceptance, safety within the space, it provided solidarity in numbers, and it contributed to them feeling they're not the only one. So for example, Drew said, you know, it contributes to me feeling more comfortable because it shows that there are people that are, it shows that you can disclose and nothing bad will happen. And it also shows that you have got people that you can go to and speak to in case anything happens. And Avery, which was great perspective to have, as so many people said it was specifically important that people in leadership and more powerful positions were also out in that sense. And Avery was a former head of the department and said, I think within the head of the department role, you have the responsibility to create a department in which people can be themselves. I very much believe in leading by example, and disclosing myself is part of that example. And what helps with LGBTQ+ visibility of others are employee networks, or as an equivalent for students, LGBTQ+ student societies, representatives. You know, often we have MCR specific roles in the colleges for that, and role model sheets, something that Cambridge is working on right now and other universities are already implementing. What is really, really important though, is that this role should not be expected and people should not be pressured into that. And this is so important because of emotional labor linked to being visible. I will only read one part of this quote, the first one, but feel free to take a note on the page number and look it up later if you're interested. I don't know whether I want to do the work of educating people, because at the end of the day, they get to go away and don't think about that conversation for the rest of the day, says Parker, a postgraduate student. They carry on with their work and do what they need to do. And depending on how the conversation goes, I leave feeling exhausted or angry or upset, and then I cannot get what I need to do done. So in a way, I think that labor that is expected of you when you are a representative is making the whole university experience even more difficult for marginalized individuals and communities when it is hard enough as it is, which is why also Parker decided not to come out as genderqueer. And it's also a sense of privilege, because just wishing for visibility is a sense of privilege. As Eddie, whose original quote we heard right at the beginning, said in a follow-up email 2 years later. So when I did a third member checking with Eddie, she kind of said, it's so interesting reading back what I said 2 years ago. Today it would be different. Of course, me as a researcher, I replied, how would it be different? And she said that she wrote it in an email and consented to me sharing it. I still think representation is valuable, especially to LGBT people in the first few years after they come out or start to identify in particular ways. But I guess I have become more aware of the fact that many members of our communities face far more acute issues regarding things like immediate safety or housing. Although I definitely did have concerns about my safety at 19, I didn't face the levels of violence and harassment that are standard for my friends who are more visibly gender non-conforming than myself, including in Cambridge. I couldn't picture what my future could look like as a lesbian, and representation helped with that. But I felt safe enough to take for granted the fact that I had a future, and one that might include dinners in nice houses. Visibly gender non-conforming people, particularly those who are trans women and or BME, face extraordinary levels of violence daily in some parts of the world, including in the UK, such that their futures often can't be taken for granted. It really got under my skin. It actually still does. So yeah, kind of as a follow-up on the 3 quotes on future prospects, right? The first one from Anna Bitter, then from Eddie, and then from Eddie 2 years later. Right. The second one, we have organizational symbols and signs of support, which in itself is visibility, but not of being visibility oneself, but being visible as being pro-LGBTQ+ as an organization, or as a non-LGBTQ+ identifying member, and that's when we would speak of allyship. So what would help would be, of course, rainbow flags and safe space, stickers and posters and events and research around it, and religious services and pronouns put into email signatures. All of that really, really helped. And basically what Kate said is that proactivity is so important, this is now the quote, because we live in a society where LGBTQ people are marginalized. There is more need to be explicit that you are okay with LGBTQ and that you want to celebrate it, because the overall context is that there is still a degree of marginalization. And in that sense, silence about LGBTQ is never good. The third one is intellectual relevance. That would refer to LGBTQ+ inclusive curricula and LGBTQ+ research. And we have kind of very different students' experiences that just show how important a curriculum is, with Kai feeling like his gayness doesn't have a place in his course nor his research because it's just not taught. And Mia, on the other hand, an undergraduate student, loving her degree because it's so LGBTQ+ inclusive, and it makes her personal experience professionally relevant, which contributed to her feeling safe and comfortable to come out as queer. That's much easier, of course, for humanities and social sciences, you might think, but there are many initiatives that focus on exactly intellectual relevance for STEM fields, right? Kind of saying, no, we do have representation, and queer perspectives can also be really valuable for the natural sciences. And finally, trans-specific inclusion practices. So basically what I mean with that is that so far with sexuality, we spoke about making these identities relevant with LGBTQ plus inclusive curricula and research and all of that. Now, LGBTQ plus identities that relate to gender don't need that. They are already professionally relevant. And the best examples is pronouns. As Blake said, being bisexual has never been a big part of my identity because it doesn't have to be. However, I need to be gendered correctly. So my gender has to be part of my professional life. And Dawn kind of said that pronouns shape all the social interactions and the social treatment, and therefore it is professionally relevant. So what helps is, or what is really important actually, is to not assume any gender identifications and to normalize the asking and the sharing of pronouns. What this would be is putting pronouns in the email signature on Zoom, as I have something like that. And it is so important because, so in addition to Transspecific identities being much more relevant for an academic professional setting, these are also identities that are more stigmatized and also more visible, with some participants saying that disclosure was in a context that was relevant to them because they felt they didn't have a choice. So if that is linked to then additional stigmatization and they're not even being able to decide for oneself whether to come out or not, it is so important that we create environments where people feel safe, at least safe and supported, and as normalized in their identities and reassured in that as possible. Summary, which will probably be a relief for Henriette, who had a look at the time. So we had these two big questions, remember? LGBTQ plus inclusion at universities, why it matters. And in summary, I would say it matters because universities are social spaces in which individuals spend numerous hours to sleep, live, eat, socialize, learn, grow, challenge themselves, establish themselves, reinvent themselves, or simply earn a living. And this time is mostly spent around others, which means that how people feel, behave, and are treated also impacts the people around them. Therefore, LGBTQ plus inclusion is relevant for everyone, not just LGBTQ plus identifying individuals. And that is also a responsibility of the university to ensure that all of its members are safe and well, and it's something that will benefit them as a business in return as well. And what we can do is important inclusion practices that can be implemented are LGBTQ plus visibility. And as you remember, they are two-dimensional. So the one in being LGBTQ plus oneself, and the other one in being pro-LGBTQ plus as an university or as an individual who does not identify as part of the community. Now, the former, being LGBTQ plus oneself, should never be expected or pressured. And even if people volunteer for a diversity champion position, I think it's really important to organizationally acknowledge that additional labor we've heard, and also to reduce that additional labor in either offering trainings for normative people or just financially contributing to people's efforts in these roles. And LGBTQ plus identities referring to sexuality can be made more professionally relevant through LGBTQ plus inclusive curricula and research, but identities that refer to gender are already professionally relevant. So these are trans-specific inclusion practices, especially in terms of pronouns. It's important to normalize the sharing, not assuming of those, and to support individuals in navigating these identities that are related to identities that are more stigmatized and more visible as well. So that should have been a lot of food for thought. I can't wait to hear questions. If you have any questions you don't want to ask now, or if you are watching that on YouTube, feel free to get in touch. My email address is ets31@can.ac.uk. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you to you, Elisabeth, for a really interesting talk, and lovely to see all the quotes from individuals and to get to hear not just, you know, numbers and outcomes, but people's individual voices. That's lovely. There have some questions have come in for you. So I'm just going to read the first one out, and but it's great to see that you're happy for emails to come in if we don't have time to answer all the questions. So this is a question from Aidan, or actually two questions. says, you mentioned the history of the term coming out as related to debutante balls, etc. What about the meaning and the use of coming out in social movements for LGBTQ rights? Thinking here of the Abigail Seguy's work on Harvey Milk, who urged gay people to come out in order to defeat a California initiative to ban gay people from teaching in public schools. So in this context, coming out is not only about visibility on a representational level, but implied literally coming out. And how might this slightly different conceptualization of coming out change the interpretation of your data, if at all?
Right, okay.
That's the first question.
That's the first one. I took some notes. Do you want to tell me the second one as well, so I can know which one to prioritize based on my knowledge?
Yeah, so the second question by Aidan is, did any of the participants in your study talk about not wanting to be out, or the problems or potential benefits of passing on the dangers of being outed or clocked?
Okay. Great, that is a relief, because the first question, as much as I really appreciate it, so important, I don't feel at this point in the position to really give you an elaborate answer on it. So I must say, you know, we're all constantly learning, and I'm glad you brought this to my attention so I can look into it further. But I would need to look into it further and then respond to it. So please feel free to get in touch with me and we can continue this conversation. But I have engaged with coming out etymology and the concept in a critical way in my just recently published journal article, which is called 3-Lens Typology of Coming Out. So that already gives some, it creates a bigger context for that discussion, but I have not specifically considered that concrete point Aidan raised. So let's pass that one for now, if that's okay, and I will focus on the second one, which I feel prepared to answer. So in terms of not wanting to be out, that was specifically relevant for trans individuals among my participants, especially if they were already passing. Some of them said now that they're passing, they don't feel the urge to come out because finally they are passing. Why would they, in that sense, right? So that was just another aspect of the data that diversified the findings in that sense. And this is also why I like to kind of have these different areas of identity groups in a way linked to LGBTQA+, because as I said, in terms of gender, we have the gender identification now, which especially if people were identifying not as male or as female, or in terms of not passing in you know, their visibility, if they had gender neutral pronouns as well, that would out them already in a sense. But then the second aspect is obviously the background, right? So we had participants where they did not want to come out because they were really happy that they were passing in that sense, but often they had a sexual orientation, so a different identity area linked to the acronym where they then were coming out. So again, different coming outs were navigated at the same time. But regarding trans individuals, that was one of the reasons. As was also, of course, the additional labor, as we heard in one of the quotes, right? Where one of the participants said, I didn't read that one specifically out, but it was the one participant acknowledging the additional labor linked to being a representative and therefore making an informed decision not to come out as genderqueer. And actually this person said, this is, as in a sense, pride as well. This is a decision that is linked to pride. You shouldn't feel pressure to come out, right? If it's harmful for your current situation. So I think really, really important here as well in terms of challenging a coming out imperative.
Okay, thank you so much, Elisabeth. I don't, oh yeah, there's one, we're going to take one last question, even though it's slightly after 7 o'clock already. And this is from D. Prince. Was there data about people who are partly out in some spaces, but not others? For example, in the case of people who are out at university, but not at home, and any ways the institutions could help with this?
Right. I had participants say, mainly staff members, how important it is to provide housing opportunities for those students who are out in the university, but don't have a safe space at home, to be more accommodating regarding those students. But because, you know, in a qualitative study, you get such rich data, you have to be focused. So I really focused on the university setting. Where relevant, participants could bring up family space. I remember one, but the person was out there as well. It was actually that the family was very worried about them finding employment as a trans woman. And now that the person had such great experiences, fortunately at Cambridge, the family wasn't worried anymore, but that was the only case where we had this intersection between family and university space per se. I'm now thinking, because again, it's also 2 years ago, and I, in the meantime, did so many more interviews with participants. So I can't think of a specific case right now. Also being aware, of course, that participants would only respond to the study invitation if they would feel like safe to some extent, right, to be visible potentially. So I know that, you know, most of the participants from this study were already feeling quite comfortable and were very visible and out in their identities. So there might also be a bias in doing this research in itself. I have more data on that question with my PhD research, but I can't quite discuss that yet. But please keep an eye on future publications and get in touch to discuss it further.
Okay. I see there's one more question that has just come in. Eden, I'm really sorry, but I think that we have to finish here and let everyone go, especially our guest speaker. But I hope, Eden, that you'll feel comfortable to just send an email to Elisabeth and ask the question there. Elisabeth, we are going to wrap up. Thank you once again for being our speaker, and thanks for very interesting information about this place that, as you say, is a bit home to all of us, and where I was surprised to see you think that we do a lot of sleeping. And with that note, I will say thank you once again, and thank you to the audience, and I hope that you all have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.